Hey, so I decided to pre-record this one so that I don't get distracted with comments coming in live because the topic is it's important and delicate, and I don't want to get distracted and lose what I was trying to say. So today I saw a post that was making the rounds talking about the supposed statistics on abuse, and it said that 1 in 3 women is experiencing some form of domestic violence or relationship abuse. But the post was going on further to say that the statistic was actually a significant underestimation because it wasn't taking into account all of the other forms of abuse that aren't physical. So number one, I would say that it's entirely possible that the 1 in 3 statistic is a bit inflated due to a watering down of the definition of abuse in the first place, but that's not even the primary issue. So if we're saying at baseline, let's take it that that's true. 33% of women are in abusive marriages, supposedly. But that's a significant underestimation. Basically what the post is saying then is that at least half of married women are in an abusive relationship when you take into account emotional abuse or financial abuse, the definitions of which are so general at this point that they actually encompass a huge number of relationships with abuse coming from either gender. So I wanted to, in preparation for this, actually go and look up what is the technical criteria for defining emotional abuse. And I pulled this from a list put out by Justice Canada. And I'm going to kind of go through bit by bit these criterias of emotional abuse and explain how women commonly do this in their relationships, even though it's generally overlooked. And how do we end up in this position where we can very much have church leaders thinking up to half of women are secretly concealing that they're in an abusive relationship? And how does this impact the messaging that men and boys receive in the church? So I'm going to go through and address all of this. This video is going to be a little bit on the longer side because of that, but it is very important because a problem that we're seeing is there are so many churches in which engaging the men isn't happening. The men don't want to be at the Bible studies. The men aren't in the pews. The women are constantly wondering, why are our husbands not leading? And then this just ripples out. And so if we have messages circulating that we should just pity half of the wives in the pews at church because they're all suffering at the hands of these secretly evil men, we are undermining marriages and families and undermining young men's sense of themselves as they're growing up, and it's just not a helpful attitude. We need to be worried about holding both men and women accountable for the shortcomings that we all have. So let's take a closer look at emotional abuse. And this messaging is going to be largely geared towards ladies, but the criteria is the same whether you're a man or a woman. So if you're watching this and you're a guy and you notice you do some of these things, work on it. But I'm going to mostly talk to women and frame it from that perspective simply because we don't get talked to enough about this. And a lot of times when we engage in this behavior, we are told that it's excusable and acceptable. And I would like to challenge that. And I come at that as someone that has grown up with the same societal messaging as all of the other women in the United States, and being prone to some of the same blinders being in place or the same double standards that I have to consciously continually address. But this needs to be talked about, and this needs to be considered before we continue spreading the message that half of men are secretly abusers. We don't want our little boys growing up hearing that message. And we owe more than that to our husbands and our fathers. So let's take a look at this pattern and how it can play out. So defining emotional abuse begins with using it's at its baseline, non-physical. It doesn't involve putting your hands on someone or throwing things at them, making them scared via your physical actions. This is just none of that. So it involves belittling, insulting, putting down, making threats or ultimatums, and making your victim feel threatened or like they're inferior, making them feel ashamed or degraded. All right, that's only half the list. But I'm gonna break it down starting there. So it has become just watch a sitcom, watch a movie, go scan some internet comments for a little bit in any moms or marriage group. It's become very commonplace and acceptable for women to belittle and insult their husbands in front of their friends, openly on the internet. It's a fun joke to call your husband a child. It is very common for women to put ultimatums on the table when they're not getting their way. And they'll say that it's because their husband does X, their husband was oftentimes being emotionally abusive towards them. But they're failing to assess the number of times that they had themselves first started making snide remarks or condescending comments or absolutely disregarding something that was important to him because they insisted they knew better. Because you know what, a lot of times when we do this to men, they're not going to start crying like we will. They're not going to like make a big scene about how badly we hurt their feelings, right? Because they're conditioned a little differently, to kind of like try to brush it off. Oftentimes when you even see men interact with each other, they're a little tougher with their words than we are with each other as women. So we'll engage in this behavior. We'll make condescending, rude comments, and our husbands don't react emotionally outwardly. So we just never register it in our heads that is in fact an emotionally abusive behavior. It never registers, but eventually what happens in a lot of relationships is the partner on the receiving end, the guy, gets tired eventually and he starts pulling back or engaging in other behaviors or making snappy remarks in return that hurt her feelings and make her feel so shocked and appalled and neglected. And then she expresses those feelings because women, we are supposed to be in touch with our emotions. It's not a bad thing. But when we fail to understand how these reactions to emotional abuse may differ between men and women, it gets very easy for us women to fail to consider we've been doing it the whole time. So, some other things that this can manifest as, besides the like openly mocking your spouse in front of friends, sitting around with other women and talking about what a irresponsible, dirty child he is. Like I've witnessed people do this. Like I'm in person even, like, and I've heard from virtually every woman that it's just women complain about their husbands in these ways to other women, and they say these sorts of things to their husbands' faces. If the tables are flipped and any woman comes and she's, hurt and crying because her husband said something similar to her, people won't hesitate to say that he's abusing her. But if the woman is doing this on a regular basis to her husband, we don't challenge them the same way. And when it spirals out further, we don't generally hold her accountable for her part of the deterioration in the relationship, because an instinct to protect her sets in. Another way that this can come out is ignoring his opinions and values. Honestly, a lot of Christian women in the churches are so guilty of this. They get an idea in their head of what a godly man should be, what he should look like, do, act. And if their husband is not that, they use their religion as grounds to overrule their husband on everything from parenting to what church they go to even what kind of religious doctrine they teach their children. They will overrule him and degrade his entire worldview, his opinions, his hobbies for not being godly enough. And in church communities, a lot of times they'll be empowered to do this because it's being wrapped in the guise of loving Jesus. even though such behavior actually falls under the category of emotional abuse, and Jesus didn't advocate wives to be emotionally abusive in their relationships, the scripture repeatedly encourages wives to be submissive and loving. So, but this it really much plays out in the church communities, because when we convince ourselves that what we're doing is what's required of us by God, like, we can convince ourselves to engage in any number of cruel behaviors. And this really plays out in marriages, which ultimately drives men from the churches, especially when leadership in the churches encourages the behavior. Another way that this can manifest, this emotional abuse can manifest, especially out of women, and it's not exclusively, but a lot of times women gatekeep sex badly. And I'm not talking about when, like, a couple has a regular sex life and then, like, someone's, like, tired and not in the mood and says no occasionally, right? Now I'm talking about someone that routinely and habitually denies sexual contact with their spouse and says that it doesn't matter because the lower libido spouse doesn't find it important. So they're neglecting the other spouse's emotional and physical needs. And I mean, I have witnessed women laughing about having done this for 6 months, a year or more after having a baby, just callously not caring, with no sense of registering that actually that's a form of emotional abuse too. But what then can sometimes happen in those situations is then when the husband's grumpy and is distant, and is suddenly not home very often because his wife has been clearly sending the message that she doesn't love him and she doesn't care about his needs, and he is, being, like, shamed and put down for having them, that, he's then turned into the villain in that situation because no one wants to have the conversation about how was the other party contributing. So other examples that Justice Canada gave of emotional abuse would be denying the abuse is happening and blaming the victim. So a lot of times this is where emotional abuse gets so messy, especially between men and women. So what can often happen is, say, a pastor, a counselor, just someone, you will get a woman coming in talking about the absolutely awful things that her husband said to her, and saying that, he was blaming her for him losing his temper and bringing up all these things that she's done. And then she's, he denies that, he hurt her feelings. And it's just like they're trying to figure out who's to blame. And then when you try to point out to the woman that maybe all of those times she said similar sorts of things to him, she was also engaging in abuse and she was contributing to putting fuel on the fire and hurting her marriage, she doesn't really want to hear it. A person, actually, a pastor who tries to have that conversation may, in fact, themselves be accused of victim blaming. But a woman doing this is, in and of itself, by definition, emotional abuse. When a woman wants to deny that she herself has been saying things that were harsh or belittling or mean long before her husband got fed up, when she doesn't want to look at how her passive-aggressive comments or her jokes with her friends were emotionally abusing him, she is engaging in more emotional abuse by denying that and shifting the blame to her husband entirely, because, well, if he did things differently, I wouldn't have to be like that, right? Or if he was a different person, I wouldn't have to be that way with him. What's amazing about this dynamic is that it's so unbelievably common, but at the same time, people are in such denial about it that they get upset if you try to talk about it, even though it's literally portrayed constantly in media, movies, commercials. It's everywhere. And yet, I guess it's the elephant in the room. People don't want to acknowledge it. This is a good one. Another example of emotional abuse is isolating your victim from other people. So what does this look like when a woman is emotionally abusing her husband? Well, how many men have you met that get given hell for going out with their friends? I personally have met a number of guys. I've met wives that act like their husband has done something awful for having a life outside the house. Even though, you know, she may go find time for self-care or going out with her girlfriends. There is this sense of feeling entitled, especially once you have kids, to completely isolating your spouse. And we talk about it in very theatrical, dramatized terms when we're talking about the extreme caricature of the abusive man that some men embody, but doesn't actually account for most of them. But we don't talk about how this plays out when the woman of the relationship is so like she gets to be so controlling of her husband's time that she has a meltdown if he goes out for a guy's night. And this is a real thing that a lot of men experience and a lot of women feel okay with, because they'll say, oh, well, I'm home all day with the baby. So since he gets to go out of the house to work and I have to deal with the kids, and I'm going to go out now. And he's already got so much time away. Like, that's common. It's so common, but it is actually technically, by definition, a form of emotional abuse to emotionally guilt your spouse into not having a life outside of you and the kids. So what's another one that I listed here? Oh, lying. Lying is a form of emotional abuse. So go look at your Instagram reels when you're done listening to this talk, if you've made it this far, and go see how many you can find making fun of women lying to their husbands, lying about the Amazon packages, getting their delivery driver to conceal the package and put it on the side of their house, lying to their husband about how much they're spending. Women have also oftentimes, like, just as much as guys might, they'll lie about who they're talking to. They'll hide conversations. And when you do this stuff, regardless of what your reasons are, oh, well, it might make him mad. Oh, okay, well, maybe you shouldn't do it. If you have to lie about it, you're engaging in a form of emotional abuse. So we as a culture are literally making it a joke to engage in emotional abuse as women, to the point that we don't even want to talk about it. We make videos for fun on the internet about emotionally abusing our husbands. I mean, I don't, because I think that's twisted, but like, people do. Even some women that are honestly in their own hearts trying to have a good, godly marriage are still online making these videos like advocating for emotionally abusive behavior and making fun of it. Another one is withholding info, which is another big thing that ties in with the lying and the spending. Honestly, I was getting ads for a while they were really trying to say that a man putting his wife on a budget was emotional abuse, where we literally have women making reels encouraging other women to lie about how much they're spending and take money without asking, and to completely disregard the family budget to buy what they want and then hide it. Like, we have this as a whole culture making this into a joke, and it is, by definition, emotional abuse. And then this one was actually spelled out word for word on the website, treating them like a child. According to Justice Canada, treating your spouse like a child is by definition emotional abuse. Controlling them, telling them like how to dress, who they can talk to, scolding them like they're your kid, all of that qualifies as emotional abuse. I did not make up these definitions. I pulled it from a government site, all right? Like, it is like the accepted list. And there's not a single thing on this list that I do not routinely see virtually all women I know doing at least some of. Now, here's the thing. We've gotten into this really watered down definition of abuse because the truth is almost every couple that's ever had like a few ugly fights has done something on this list. Now we're getting to this point that like literally the post that spawned this message on today was done with the goal of saying that we need to like have sympathy and pity for all of the abused women sitting in the pews at church. But what about the guys, right? If like we honestly assess this list of emotional abuse, what percentage of women are engaging in emotionally abusive behavior in those same pews? Should we be worried about the lack of men in the pews because we're telling women that they're the victims when they're engaging in all of this abusive behavior themselves? That's not serving the people. That is not shepherding the flock. And that is encouraging more abuse, more fatherless homes, and it's encouraging men to step out of their role, because who really wants to go to church when they are experiencing emotional abuse and then being told that they're bad men because they are struggling to gracefully continue to deal with the emotional abuse they're suffering? If I were a man, I would struggle to hear that messaging. And so when we have people in leadership positions in ministry pushing this dialogue that most men are abusing their wives and they don't want to talk about the fact that, well, so are most women, and what do we do with this? Well, we're not doing ministry correctly. Holding someone accountable for something that they've done wrong is an act of mercy. One cannot receive forgiveness if they don't repent, and one cannot repent from a behavior or an attitude or a state of heart if they continue to insist they're justified in it. And oftentimes when we have women engaging in this emotionally abusive behavior, the feedback that they will be given is that somehow they're allowed to do this because their husband wasn't being a good enough man, which is then an institutional encouraging of victim blaming when women are the perpetrator. And what happens when this continues? When women get away with it? Why do we get away with it so easily? I think the reason we get away with it so easily is that, well, when men snap, the stakes are higher. Generally, they're bigger, they're stronger. When they are pushed past their limit, the damage that a woman sustains is often greater. Also, women being more emotional oftentimes, which I don't say that as an insult. And if someone perceives that as an insult, I invite you to examine the attitudes that brought you to feeling that having those emotions was a liability. It's not, but we can absolutely use it inappropriately. And that often happens in these situations when women come and complain about verbal and emotional abuse. Because one of the definitions is the person feels threatened, or they feel inferior, or they feel degraded, and women are way up in their feelings more than men these days most of the time. So we'll cry, we'll be hurt, we'll talk about how hurt we are, and so that makes it easier for people to sympathize with whatever bad person hurt our feelings. It's not bad that people have that desire to respond with sensitivity to an emotional woman. I think that that's an important part of preserving femininity. It really is. But at the same time, as women, we need to work on self-reflection so that we don't exploit that tendency, as some women do. A thing that really bothers me, though, about all of this is that we've gotten to a point where people are saying emotional abuse is grounds for a divorce, even within the church. And they'll say that to women, and women will then feel entitled to leave their awful, abusive, emotionally abusive husbands, keep them away from their children, etc., because he's just so emotionally abusive, without reflecting on the fact that they were doing it too the whole time, in some level, that they engaged in the same exact behaviors. And yeah, that's actually, I forgot to mention that. Under the threats and ultimatums, that's a big one that women will do. They'll threaten divorce, or they'll threaten that they're going to keep their kids away from the man. People might not want to believe that that happens in people's fights, but it does. Spend like 20 minutes talking to any family law attorney, and like, you'll know it's true. It's so common. That is a threat that is levied a lot. And women are then encouraged to do this on the grounds of emotional abuse. And I do not think that emotional abuse is grounds for a divorce, because oftentimes, the vast majority of times, it's not just one person doing it. It's both people contributing in some way or another. It can absolutely be grounds for separation depending on the volatility of the relationship. And the reason for that is, most of the time, when domestic violence incidences have spilled over, this emotional abuse has been going on between both partners for a while. You don't often meet domestic violence victims that are just perfectly sweet and demure people. A lot of times, the more common arrangement is you have a feisty, fiery, independent, loudmouth, like brash woman who's gonna fight her stance and stand up for herself, and the arguments are vicious. And then at times they get really bad. And so if there is emotional abuse going on, it may be sensible to initiate a separation so that y'all can get help and space and work on communicating more effectively your emotions without playing all those games. Because if the situation is volatile, it could become more volatile if people aren't getting real about what they're both doing to hurt each other. And so it may be necessary to separate for emotional abuse before it gets to that point. But there's a thing that people often forget. Separating doesn't mean you're divorcing. You can absolutely willfully separate because you have a general dedication to your marriage. You can make that choice, and you can like choose that if you're experiencing this kind of situation, but you don't want to really end it. Like, you don't have to take that mentality. And really, if emotional abuse is your grounds for divorce, you're not trying hard enough. Like, there are solutions that you could be trying to work on before throwing in the towel and breaking up your family, especially when we stop and consider, based on this list, honestly, I don't know many women that have not engaged in some form of emotional abuse towards their partner at one time or another. And if that's the case, we should just say everyone should get a divorce. And I don't believe that. I think people can work on things. More often than people are willing to admit, when relationships are falling apart in these ways, really, it is both people contributing. Emotional abuse and verbal abuse is so often a two-way street. You may need space, but that is not grounds to end your marriage in and of itself. And it's really important for women to get real with each other and ourselves and hold ourselves accountable, because when we don't, and we say it's totally fine for us to be emotionally abusive, but then we have like a shocked Pikachu face when a man doesn't respond like Jesus himself by letting us abuse him indefinitely in silence, we're not being reasonable. That's just not fair or reasonable. And it's not kind, it's not loving. And then I just want to leave you on this to consider. When you assume that your emotional abuse isn't emotional abuse and that it doesn't hurt your husband because he's stoic for a while, it is a fatal error. And if you can't address these behaviors in yourself and you decide to end your marriage because your husband's emotionally abusive, but you haven't gotten real about yourself, you may find yourself wondering why every single guy you're with seems to be bad. Why is he the same? Well, here's the thing. If you have a habitual pattern of emotionally abusing your partner and you don't address it, you're going to emotionally abuse every guy you're with, and he's going to ultimately respond back with reactive abuse. And then you're going to just continue the same cycle. It does not end until you take the responsibility on yourself to stop this extensive list of emotionally abusive behaviors that society tells you is normal and acceptable. It's not. It doesn't matter that you're a woman. It's still not okay. And this is something that virtually every woman I know struggles with to some extent, or has struggled with at one time or another, because we are told it is okay and it's normal. And I think it's very important for everyone to understand, if you want to have conversations about emotional abuse, you need to be real about the number of men sitting in the pews at your church that have been subjected to it consistently in every relationship they've been part of since high school. If you want to have these conversations and have them taken seriously, you need to get real about how both people are contributing, and get real about how emotional abuse that goes unaddressed lays the foundation for later domestic violence. And women have power to stop this from happening by holding ourselves accountable for the abuse that we bring to the table. And so many of us do. So think about it. Get real with yourself about how are you treating your husband. It's not funny to treat him like a child. It's not funny to lie about what you're spending. It's not funny to belittle him or mock him online. Those are all, by definition, making you an abuser. And you cannot turn around and cry about what an abuser your husband is if he reacts to you engaging in prolonged emotional abuse towards him. It's not okay. And if this is something you know you need to work on, get honest about it and seek out help, seek out a therapist, seek out coaching, seek out books to read to work on this. The reason I don't believe this is grounds for divorce is because it's so common between both men and women towards each other, because we aren't prepared well on how to become one in marriage and treat our spouse with respect. We're encouraged to be like this. And that being the case, there needs to be a measure of understanding and compassion for the fact that we are all figuring this out, oftentimes with very little guidance. And I do believe that these are things we can work on before it spins out of control, but you have to be real about what it means, and do not buy into this nonsensical messaging that says most men are abusing their sweet little angelic wives. It's not true. It just isn't. That is a very patronizing way to view the women of our day with all of the rights and freedoms that we have. So let's hold ourselves accountable. And just as much as we want to make good men better, let's work on making good women better too. And work against this narrative that tells us we don't have to try either. All right, I hope that everyone has a good day.